part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. So, Ben Barnes is having a real moment right now. He's having a real moment between, obviously, he's playing the Darkling on Shadow and Bone.
So good.
But also there's been a resurgence of the Marauders fan cast on TikTok with him as Sirius Black. I think it's very funny. I literally, if you say Ben Barnes, my first thought is Sirius Black, a role that he has never played. But it felt like a good time to look at a role that he has actually played, which is the titular character in Dorian Gray. And especially considering it's based on a classic sort of early work of queer literature, Pride Month felt like a good time to do it. So we decided to watch Dorian Gray this month, and it was an experience.
It was an experience. So Dorian Gray was released in 2009. Ironically, it was released on September 9th, 2009, which is 090909, which means forever and infinity. It is obviously a fantasy horror drama. It was based on Oscar Wilde's 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was directed by Oliver Parker, written by Toby Finlay in his screenwriting debut, and it stars Ben Barnes, Colin Firth, Ben Chaplin, Rebecca Hall, and Fiona Shaw.
So I'm a big fan of Oscar Wilde. I have been since I was like 15 years old and developed a weird obsession with Oscar Wilde. But actually, The Picture of Dorian Gray is one of the few Wilde works that I haven't read. I've read a lot of his poetry. I earlier this year finished reading De Profundis. I've read most of the plays, but I actually haven't gotten to The Picture of Dorian Gray. And after seeing this, I'm like, okay, I need to read it just so I know what in that was it and what wasn't. But from everything that I read about this movie, this is a very loose adaptation. And I watched a digital theater production from a couple of theaters in the UK, including the Barn Theatre earlier this year, which for one thing had Alfie Enoch in it. So I loved it. That was a modern adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And that felt, strangely enough, a lot more true to the story than this did. But you know, it was kind of funny going into this. I looked on Letterboxd to see what people had to say about it, and I would say 9 out of 10 of the Letterboxd reviews mentioned Ben Barnes. This is a film that I think is exclusively watched for thirst purposes.
Oh yeah.
And you know what? Long-haired Ben Barnes, yes, I get it. I understand. He's not my, it's one of those things. I understand why people think he's attractive. I think he's attractive. He's not like one of my celebrity crushes or anything, but you know, I get it.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
This also has one of my favorite actors in it, giving some sort of performance. It's a very different type of role for Colin Firth. I love to see him in, you know, more gray or dark roles. I'm not really sure exactly what he's doing in this movie. You know, a lot of this movie is kind of just the definition of choices were made. Choices were made. The costumes are great. Some of the sets are pretty good. I think the cinematography is pretty bad. I really thought this was going to be more aesthetically pleasing than it is. I think I was expecting something more. This film, it feels like it goes between being over dramatic and being lifeless, and it just kind of pinballs back and forth between them. You know, I also will say one thing that I did appreciate, they make Dorian very explicitly bisexual, which I think is great. Otherwise, though, the movie is a bit depraved in its tastes.
Just a little bit.
I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase this that doesn't get us an explicit rating on Spotify. They make Dorian into some interesting things.
He's got a little sadism going on.
Yeah, yeah, and the way that they depict it is interesting.
It's a choice.
I was talking to a friend about this movie because one of my friends, Dan, saw that I logged this on Letterboxd, and he texted me this morning. He was like, "You watched Dorian Gray?" I was like, For better or for worse, I did." And I was talking to him, and I said, "I would love to see another adaptation of Dorian Gray done by like Del Toro."
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a way to make Dorian Gray in a way that really captures the themes of the novel. It is really aesthetically pleasing and really leans into the gothic nature of it. And sadly, for all that Ben Barnes is hot, this film is not that.
Yeah. It was a special film. Thanks to YouTube. I think I saw this movie in like 2010. It was, around the height of Ben Barnes' Serious Black fan casting. So of course I watched it. And I remember it being an experience then to my very innocent 2010 self.
Oh god.
So this is actually the first time I've rewatched it since. I basically feel like I know the entire movie inside and out thanks to my interest in watching Serious Black fan cast videos on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Tumblr, anywhere that you will see fan art for the Black family. You've seen all of these clips of this movie, basically. Blood, gore, everything in between. But it was an experience. After watching this and seeing Colin in both this and Shakespeare in Love, I'm really going to need him to be in more of these like morally gray villain type roles. He does it so well. And in both of those films, I'm not 100% sure what his character's purpose is, but he does it well. So, this film is just kind of like one long wandering walk through someone's mind who's just really into Ben Barnes, but vaguely interested in the story of Dorian Gray. Did that feel that way to you? Like the mechanics of the movie kind of just wandered?
It also it takes some weird departures from the actual, story of the Picture of Dorian Gray.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's a really gripping story, and parts of this movie were so boring.
Yes.
That it was almost impressive that they managed to make this story boring.
I was just impressed by the fact that after I finished watching it, I was like, what exactly was the plot of that movie? Like,
I also just...
It wasn't even horror.
I thought about the fact that if Ben Barnes was not in this movie, if they had cast, this is gonna sound mean, if they'd cast, a mediocre-looking man in the role of Dorian Gray...
It would not have worked.
There would be no freaking reason for this movie to exist.
No. And the thing is, afterwards I was sitting there and I was trying to figure out what the plot of this movie is. Because it's not a faithful adaptation of the portrait of Dorian Gray. And it's like a murder film, kind of like it wanted to be Perfume at points, and not just because of her. And I saw a review that mentioned the fact that there isn't enough horror for this to truly be a horror film, because yes, there's horrific things that happen, but very little of the plot has to do with the horror. And it's not really, it's some body horror, obviously, with the portrait stuff, but even then it doesn't really commit to the horror. There's no suspense because there's no actual plot, so it can't really be a thriller. It's just like an hour and 50 minutes of people.
Special effects
are a choice.
The special effects are,
they exist.
Somebody got paid to do that.
And there's so much depravity, and I am utterly obsessed with the fact that anytime we get into vaguely Hellfire Club aesthetics in England, they just go full tilt. There has never been a full in-between for that brand of gentleman's depravity. And it fascinates me because I know those kind of men were not great in London or anywhere at any time. but the way that it's portrayed on film is something that exists purely on its own, like consistently throughout it.
Yep.
It's I don't know what that is. If there's like a micro genre for men's depravity in Victorian / Regency / whatever period of London somebody was intrigued by, somebody should create like a letterbox film thingy where you have like all the films in this particular niche genre, because there's a bit, and it's interesting.
It's like
to me.
I feel like you even then could give like a special mention to like the Riot Club.
100%. First thought was Riot Club. The
Yep.
TV show Harlots has a whole subplot about it.
Yep.
Harlots is really good if anybody's looking for television recommendations. There's even a little bit of it. Oh, I'm blanking on the name of the film. It's like Here and Gone, but it's in a lot of films, and it's a weirdly sinister subplot that's never really fully delved into.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by the Hellfire Club, like Rossetti and Ruskin, and I have a Ruskin book sitting across the room from me as I speak. It's so fascinating to me what
Absolutely.
these gentlemen get themselves up to. And Dorian Gray gets himself up to a lot of things in this movie, and all of it is because of Colin Firth.
Which it is kind of funny casting, because like I'm not gonna lie, Colin Firth is the last man I would ever expect to lead me into a life of depravity.
And yet, but here's the key thing. Like is said later in the film, he wants to see other people doing it, but he has very little interest in doing it himself, which I thought was so interesting, because there's so many people out there that enjoy leading people astray, but they don't want to be led astray.
Yep.
And it's like there's little things like that in this movie that like make you think, but they never fully develop those thoughts. So you're just kind of left wondering as an afterthought.
Yeah, which is very unlike Oscar Wilde.
No, he's very to the point.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of Oscar Wilde, we've decided not to, do a deep dive into him on the episode today, because we want to leave that open so that we can watch a film about Oscar Wilde and do that then. So instead, we're going to look like more specifically at Dorian Gray, because there's a lot to discuss with the novel that this movie is based on. So to start out, The Picture of Dorian Gray was Oscar Wilde's only novel. It is described as a gothic and philosophical novel. Again, it's all themes, unlike this film, which can't follow through with a theme. It first appeared, actually, it was in Lippincott's monthly magazine on June 20th of 1890. And what I find is interesting, in this first publishing, the editor actually had changed 500 words without Wilde knowing, because he was afraid of accusations of indecency. And sure enough, still, it was published, and they were immediately accused of promoting homosexuality. And one critic, Charles Whibley, said that Wilde was writing for none but outlawed noblemen and perverted telegraph boys. So then Wilde turns the short story into a novel. He had 6 chapters, and he actually removes some of the passages that highlight this love between Basil and Dorian. And he adds a foreword to it, which responds to some of the criticisms. And one of the things that he says in this foreword is, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. And I think it is, interesting that this is a conversation that's being had in 1890 in England. And I feel like this is a conversation that I see going on today on Twitter, in terms of like, you can have a character doing immoral things and it doesn't mean you're promoting immorality. Like,
yes. When I was reading this, I was like, this is such a relevant conversation, and it drives me crazy.
Never thought that there would be some sort of weird connection between like Dorian Gray and Kylo Ren, and yet.
Or the Darkling.
Yep. And yet.
To tie it into Ben
Yeah,
Barnes.
there we go. There we go. But whenever Wilde was, making this new version of it, he also added in some passages that were new, and in particular, the plotline with James Vane, Sybil Vane's brother, who ends up trying to kill Dorian, which puts a very like Victorian theme of class struggle into it as well, and with this idea of the working man James Vane versus the sort of pampered, wealthy Dorian, which I think is interesting. But the new version was published in April of 1891, and again faced a very hostile reception. W.H. Smith actually refused to stock the book, calling it filthy. They refer to it as the filthy book, which is funny. It's also one of those funny things whenever I read this that like W.H. Smith is still one of the largest booksellers in the UK. It was in 1891. My American brain struggles to comprehend that. But Samuel Henry Jays in the St. James Gazette said that the book should be burnt. And the only positive review came from a friend of Oscar Wilde's named Walter Pater. So we got, basically one good review amongst all of these. So obviously it was pretty damn controversial whenever it came out. The book borrows a lot of themes from Faust, and it references Shakespeare a lot. Like, first of all, Sybil, who is Dorian's sort of first lover, is a Shakespearean actress. And there's a lot of parallels between her death, her relationship with Dorian, and then her brother's desire for vengeance with the story of Ophelia and her brother Laertes and Hamlet, obviously. So I think that's a really interesting thing that Oscar Wilde was building off of there. Particularly whenever you also consider that there's a homosexual reading of Hamlet and his relationship with Horatio. So I think that sort of is all very interesting, the way that these things are built together. But Oscar Wilde said that the three main characters in this book are the different versions of himself. He said, Basil Hallward is what I think I am. Lord Henry is what the world thinks of me. Dorian is what I would like to be in other ages, perhaps. And so another thing that's really interesting about the picture of Dorian Gray is that there's actually three versions. Mm-hmm. There is the 1890 published magazine version, the uncensored magazine version before the editor took the 500 words out, which was actually published for the first time by the Harvard University Press in 2011. And then, of course, the actual 1891 book version. So that's something, if you've read it, I'm assuming you've probably read the 1891 book version, but I know that you can get a hold of different copies. I don't know if there's anything that sells it bound together into one version. I know I have a book that contains the original published version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with her original pre-Percy Shelley edits version of it. And I feel like there's probably something similar for this. So that would be interesting to find out. But it's kind of funny to think about how incendiary this book was whenever it came out versus how freaking boring a lot of this movie is.
Truly. It's interesting that you talked about the moral and moral book quote, feeling very timely with some of the discourse in literary Twitter and TikTok and other forms of social media. And I encountered something else that was very timely during my research for my topic of the day, which was to discuss the bisexual Dorian Gray character. Initially, this was going to be a discussion about queer readings of the picture of Dorian Gray. But while I was researching that particular topic, I discovered that very few queer resources discuss the character of Dorian Gray as a bisexual man. And I felt like this was an issue given the rampant bisexual erasure that exists pretty much anywhere you look. You can log onto Twitter right now, and I'm sure you'll see a tweet about it. I read through at least 5 And I dug around. I didn't just go off the first ones on Google because I was like, maybe there's some that have just like been filed further back in the Google search. But no, repeatedly, they very clearly refer to him only as either gay or homosexual, despite the character's obvious interests in both men and women. In fact, most of the queer written material I found tried to claim that Dorian's interests in both men and women obfuscate his identity as being just gay, which I think is interesting because that is obviously something that's discussed a lot about, like, oh, you're just interested in women for right now. You're just gay. Like, that's something that people say a lot to bisexual men in particular. That seems to be a very difficult concept for a lot of people. So it really disappointed me because I was really excited to talk about like where this is in queer literary discussions, especially since this is arguably one of the most well-known classic pieces of literature that has a queer character. And obviously, you know, like you talked about, the portrait of Dorian Gray caused, you know, Oscar a tremendous amount of trouble because people viewed it as having this homoerotic themes and people wanted to erase it. And so I think it's interesting that people are essentially trying to erase this character's identity as it is presented in the text. You know, despite this film not being the best, I was really glad that they accurately portrayed him as bisexual. And a more recent interpretation over in Penny Dreadful, they portrayed him as essentially pansexual, which also, it worked really well, but there was a whole like controversy about how they labeled the character because after that version of Dorian Gray has this sex scene with this other character, a man, the actor was like, oh, I don't want to label him. Like, he's just looking to feel human connection. It didn't really matter who it was. But the way that he like phrased it was like not so much that he was bisexual or pansexual, but that he was just interested in men for the sake of being interested in men. Like, it didn't actually matter to him. And it was like a very weird, like, a weird way to approach a very important conversation, especially with men who are bisexual. It is a very, if anyone's listening and they understand this whole like situation. It's a whole thing in media. Like, women are allowed to be bisexual. It's like, okay, but male characters are given a much stranger reaction, both creatively and fan wise, for being bisexual. So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that there's this weird way of approaching this topic. And also there's also the issue of a lot of this literary academia is outdated, and there were ideas that have evolved and continue to permeate that have changed in the more mainstream, but they still kind of persist in academia as very outdated. And so I'm hoping that maybe more people will start to revisit Dorian Gray. I feel like it's about time for this character to have a revival and for maybe there to be a new resurgence of literature and academic theses and, you know, conversations about this character, because I think he's a really fascinating character and what Oscar Wilde put into this character is really interesting. But yeah, you know, I had completely different plans for this topic today. And then I was just like, well, I feel like I need to be on a soapbox because this bothered me. It really bothered me to see this character that is so blatantly represented one way in the text just have one aspect of him brushed aside, like, oh, his whole love for Sybil didn't really matter. That was just like a whim. And I have friends who have people say those kind of things to them about their choices between, you know, dating a woman 3 years ago and dating a man now and this, and it hurts to see people be so casual about it, even about a character.
And I think, you know, with it being Pride Month,
yes,
we obviously wanted to talk about a film that has, you know, a queer character, particularly because it's based on a work by a queer author. Mm-hmm. One of the first, I think, explicitly queer authors in the English language, at least. But I also think it's important that in Pride Month and in every month that we recognize, you know, yes, we have a lot to celebrate with how far we've come, but we also still have a long way to go. And I think biphobia is one of the biggest issues right now, particularly in that like it's an issue that people who are bisexual face from straight people, but also face within the LGBT community as well. And I think that, it's important that we talk about that. And I think that the erasure of Dorian Gray's bisexuality is a part of that. Yeah. But speaking of speaking of queer men, um, I wanted to talk a bit about John Gray, who is rumored to be the inspiration for Dorian Gray. Now, he's not like the full inspiration for Dorian Gray. Um, but he is an actual gay historic figure, so I want to talk about him. And what's interesting is that whenever the novel was first published, he sort of like leaned into the rumors, but eventually he did really like distance himself from them. But he was a friend of Oscar Wilde's. He's an English poet and later a Catholic priest. He is best known for his works Silver Points, The Long Road, and Park, A Fantastic Story. He was actually born the eldest of 9 children in Bethnal Green, London in 1866, and his father was a carpenter. He began working as an apprentice to a metal worker at the age of 13, but he continued taking night classes in several languages, music, and art. At the age of 16, he passed the civil service exams and he got a job as a clerk in a post office. And then in 1888, he got a job in the Library of the Foreign Office. He also did some work as a translator. But he was part of the aesthetic movement of the 1890s, and he was friends with Ernest Dowson and Audrey Beardsley. He has a real sort of, you know, story of someone who came from the working class and rose up to uh, be a real part of the art scene in London at this time, which I think is really interesting. He met Oscar Wilde in 1889, and his relationship with Oscar Wilde was sort of at its height from 1891 to 1893. By the time Oscar Wilde goes to prison, their relationship has sort of been over for about 2 years. They did eventually have a sort of a kind of a falling out over Oscar Wilde's relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. But Wilde described Gray as, and this is a direct quote, wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp golden hair. There was something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candor of youth was there, as well as all youth's passionate purity. And other people as well describe him as having a very young, baby-like features, making him seem even younger than his age. So it's clear that, you can kind of read in some inspiration for the character of Dorian Gray, even though there's pretty significant differences between Dorian and John. Like, enough that, this isn't some sort of Dorian Gray is John Gray, but you can see, there's a reason that he was given Gray's last name. And Richard Ellman, who's one of the leading Oscar Wilde biographers, said that naming his character for Gray was a form of courtship for Oscar Wilde. Their relationship was short but very intense. And after this came out, actually, for a while, John Gray signed at least one of his letters to Oscar Wilde as Dorian, and it's thought probably more than that. And friends would sort of jokingly refer to him as that. But John had actually converted to Roman Catholicism in 1890, which a lot of people in this sort of art scene did, and he was baptized but sort of lapsed almost immediately. He didn't really get into the church until 1895. It's thought maybe because of Oscar Wilde's trial, he was sort of inspired to, change his more decadent ways and sought out the church. In 1898, at the age of 32, he entered Scots College in Rome to study for the priesthood, and in 1901 became a priest. He did also continue publishing his poetry up until 1932, though. So even though he became a Catholic priest and joined the church, he did continue on in his writing career. So after this relationship with Wilde, though, he was in a relationship with Marc-André Rafalovich, who was a Russian-born Jewish poet who had also converted to Catholicism. And Rafalovich also was a financial supporter to Gray and really enabled him to continue on with his work. And the two men actually remained together until Rafalovich died very suddenly in 1934, and Gray was absolutely devastated and died 4 months later of an illness. I also thought this was interesting. The musician Crispin Gray is his great-nephew.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of fun. But
Hmm,
I thought it was, sort of interesting to look at an actual queer figure from this time period. And particularly in that, like, this is a fascinating story. It's kind of one of those things where, in some ways, the truth of John Gray is more interesting than the character of Dorian Gray, and that you have this man who comes up from being the son of a carpenter, gets involved with these people like, Audrey Beardsley and Oscar Wilde, and then becomes a Catholic priest. It's full of plot twists.
truly.
And I wanted to share, I found one of his poems. So I'm gonna read you some poetry. This is now an audiobook.
I'm so excited.
But this poem is called Summer Past. It was written by John Gray, and it's dedicated to Oscar Wilde. There was the summer, there, warm hours of leaflet song and dripping amber sweat, oh sweet to see. The great trees condescend to cast a pearl down to the myrtles, and the proud leaves curl in ecstasy. Fruit of a quest, despair, smart of a sullen wrong. Where may they hide them yet? 1 hour, yet one. To find the moss god lurking in his nest, to see the naiad's floating hair caressed by fragrant sun beams, softly lulled the eaves, the song-tired birds to sleep, that other things might tell their secrecies. The beetle humming neath the fallen leaves, deep in what hollow do the stern gods keep their bitter silence? By what listening well where holy trees, song set, unfurl eternally the sheen of restless green?
Hmm.
It has a really interesting structure to it. That is sort of unlike a lot of other poems that I've read. But I just thought it was interesting that he dedicates that to Wilde. They're pretty openly involved, for the fact that it's, the early 1890s. Uh, but I think that John Gray is a really interesting figure, and one that not a lot of people know about nowadays. So,
Hmm. It's a very pretty poem, though.
isn't it? Another person that I think would be a good subject for a movie.
Truly. So next up is costumes. So the costumes were designed by Ruth Myers, who has also worked on Ella Enchanted, the 1991 Addams Family, and most recently, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, just to name a few recognizable titles. I found an interview that Ruth did that I thought was interesting. She's quoted to say, I thought of Dorian as a sort of Mick Jagger or Rudolph Nureyev. I wanted the look and the costumes to bring that 1960s or 19s kind of 70s idea of glamour, which I thought was really interesting. Because I can see that in some of her inspiration, because while the Dorian Gray movie is very historically, accurate, there's also touches to it that are very kind of over the top, very stylistic choices that work, especially some of the stuff with like the Harlequin moments in the film that are very over the top. I can definitely see this kind of like glamorous rock star kind of vibes with historic costumes, which I think is great. And then I found another quote that talked about Ben Barnes and his involvement in the process. Ben came to many fittings and worked very hard with me. It's a wonderful thing when you get an actor who can see his character through his costumes. Ben and I sourced a lot of modern clothes that we thought that would look right. And it's just a really great quote about finding this look for Dorian Gray. And I loved what they did with the costumes. I really had very few gripes with, what they were doing with the costumes in this particular kind of interpretation of this era. I thought it worked really well.
Yeah, I actually think that the costumes are probably the strongest thing about the movie. Not that they're um like really outstanding work or anything,
No,
but
they're very
but they're good.
they're very basic.
Yeah, they're strong, and I think, in a movie where everything else isn't all
Yes.
that strong, they really do stand out as being really nice.
Yes. And I thought her dress was lovely. Sybil's clothes were very lovely. I really did enjoy those Harlequin scenes. That's the best I can describe the lavish dancing and drinking and
Yeah.
debauchery,
Yeah.
had very like that Harlequin quality to them. That was fun. I definitely thought with the masks, my first thought was Phantom of the Opera because, that's me.
Because we're
Um,
us. Yeah.
and there were little things with like those costume choices with like the masquerade ball thing that I thought could have been kind of needled out a little bit deeper in terms of storytelling with the mask that we wear and this like facade that Dorian was putting forward. And it's all kind of subtext. It's not really actually there on the screen for you to dig into. For a film that was really just about Ben Barnes looking hot, it flipped those switches, it checked those boxes.
He does, in fact, look hot. Well, I'm glad that, this is one that's been on my list for many, many years. So it was good to finally get around to watching it. If you are listening to this and you've not watched it, I would recommend watching it. Like, I feel like we've said many times that it's not a great movie, and it's not, but it is worth watching because it does have some element of like, it's far enough into the bad that it's enjoyable.
Yes, and it's very peak 2009. So if you're looking for a mid-aughts, end of the aughts kind of feeling film, this is your best bet.
This is it.
This is it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to our 27th episode of Petticoats and Poppies History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you thought of Dorian Gray.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at NicoleAckman16. You can also follow my new Instagram account that is centered entirely around history and book-related content, which is at History Girl Nicole.
Excellent. And you can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on the Ear Glue Media website. And as always, over on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast and on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading your reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy, and happy Pride Month.
Yes, happy Pride. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. I'm not really sure exactly what he's doing in this movie.